Hi gang, David Cantor here, host of UUCC Zoom In Live. Well, our next show is coming up this coming Monday, February 8th, 8 to 9 p.m. with our special guest, Dawn Arrington. Now, many of you already know Dawn. She was voted one of the most trusted people in our congregation, which is one of many reasons why she's a member of our Ministerial Search Task Force. Of course, Dawn has already done lots of other stuff with UUCC and its predecessor, First U. But Dawn also does lots of stuff out in the community, to put it mildly. In fact, based on all the stuff that Dawn does, it might conjure up images like this. No, that's all male stuff. Let's try it again. How about this? Yeah, that's more like it. And in point of fact, in the work that Dawn does, she collaborates with all those superheroes on a wide range of activities to support her work in the community. Curious about that? Wonder how all that works out? Wondering what it's like for Dawn to be an African-American woman and a UU to boot in the age of Trump and Trumpism? How does she view it? How does she cope with it? You might want to check out Monday's show then, 8 to 9 p.m. You'll be entertained, you'll be informed, and you'll be educated. Hope to see you then. Bye now.
We share with you now the global chalice lighting of the International Council of Unitarians and Universalists for the month of February. We light this chalice in remembrance of those who laid down the foundation of our communities in the spirit of freedom, love, and tolerance, to remember that true light will outshine darkness. These are the words of Francis David, founder of the Hungarian Unitarian Church in the 16th century. Faith is the gift of God. The true signs of faith are an inner purity and love and an honest life and good deeds. Love is the ultimate interpretation and completion of the law. According to Jesus, love is the plenitude of the law. Love is a royal commandment. Love is the true freedom, which does not bear the bondage of fear. Love is the creative spirit of the world, the highest treasure of humankind. Glaube ist das Geschenk Gottes. Die wahren Zeichen des Glaubens sind innere Reinheit und Liebe, sowie aufrichtiges Leben und gute Taten. Liebe ist die treffliche Deutung und Erfüllung des Gesetzes. Jesus zufolge ist die Liebe die Fülle des Gesetzes. Liebe ist ein fröhliches Gebot. Liebe ist die wahre Freiheit, die nicht die Last der Furcht tragt. Liebe ist die schöpferische Geist der Welt, das höchste Gut, die Menschenschaft. These are the words of Francis David, founder of the Hungarian Church in 16th century. Today we celebrate the sixth principle of the Unitarian Universal Association of Congregations, which is the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Or, stated a different way, we believe in working for a peaceful, fair, and free world. Hi, I'm Reverend Joe, and I want to welcome you to worship this morning. Today we're talking about our sixth principle, the goal of world community. So there'll be a little history about the ICUU, the International Council of Unitarians and Universalists, and how we are trying to achieve this goal of being one people around the globe. There'll be music, story by Allan, reflection by Andrew Watkins. So come join us for worship.
This is my song.
We used to come together around this table when we met in person to share our joys and concerns, the things that were beautiful in our lives and the things that brought us sorrow. I share these pebbles today symbolically for all of us, because I know there are joys in people's lives that need to be celebrated. There are birthdays, maybe births, anniversaries, and just plain old good days that deserve to be celebrated. I know that there are difficult times for people. People tired of this pandemic, tired of the isolation, frightened by the events in our nation's capital, and just having a hard time. I place this last pebble into our bowl with a hope that you'll remember you are not alone, that if you reach out, someone surely will be there to celebrate with or to help comfort you, whether you're celebrating a joy or contending with a sorrow today.
Please join us in reading the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers.
This is a t-shirt. It's one of the most ordinary things I can think about that I own. And yet, it's also possibly one of the most extraordinary witnesses of my life. When you think about how intimate and how ever-present something like this is in your day-to-day life, it has a great deal to say about not only who I am, but also how I relate to the world around me. And I wonder what it is that would happen if this t-shirt could talk. What would it have to say? T-shirts are part of everybody's wardrobe at one level or another. But the other thing that they do is they link us to a world, an entire globe, in fact, of producers, purveyors, craftspeople of all types, as they knit us into a global community that we are almost always unaware of. So what is it that this t-shirt can tell me? Well, it can't speak for itself. So I did a little research. This is a Hanes Comfort Soft V-neck t-shirt. It is made in the Dominican Republic. I did a little reading about this. This manufacturing started happening in the Dominican Republic because of movement in the early 2000s to create what were called economic free zones, places where industry would have fewer taxation liabilities and fewer regulations and things like that. Definitely part of a globalizing economy, and definitely something that has some pluses, perhaps a lot of minuses in bringing this kind of work to the Dominican factory, where at least maybe 4 or 5 individuals were involved in producing the weave, cutting the fabric, patterning it, and also involved in assembly and packaging. A whole community of individuals just to produce it. Weirdly, going even further back, I looked into what the actual production side of the cotton that goes into these t-shirts comes from, and would you know it, still in the year 2021, all of the cotton that the Hanes Corporation uses comes from the Southeast United States. Of course, an industry in an area of the country that is full of a very fraught history for any consumer. That being said, cotton farming is now highly mechanized, and so there wouldn't be as many people involved in the processing of the cotton as there was in the manufacturing of the t-shirt. But there's still definitely some hands involved in getting this from its raw material state into production. Before I get this, of course, I also have to acquire it. And in America, in 2021, that means this had to be warehoused and sorted and put into a place. I'm pretty sure I bought this from Amazon.com. So that means Amazon warehouse workers were involved and delivery drivers. They were all crucial players who allowed me to have this garment that then became literally akin to myself for the time that I owned it. If that wasn't enough, if just the getting this to me wasn't enough in and of itself, the other side of the story is what happens when I'm done with it. And most clothing in our world actually has a pretty complicated afterlife. So once I'm done with this t-shirt, it's going to have a whole other journey to take. I think about it actually this time every year because we are in literally the day the Super Bowl is about to take place. And we're going to see one of the teams who's playing win. And, of course, they're going to show up on the field that night in a whole wardrobe of championship T-shirts. And it doesn't take anybody too much thinking to realize that there's a whole set of unused boxes full of other T-shirts with the other team's name on it, just waiting to have a period in some alternate universe where the game worked out differently. Where do those clothes go? Well, the answer is that most of the clothing that we consume in the Western world in 2021 becomes literally a crop unto itself. And donated or remaindered clothing all the time with absolute frequency gets shipped to places like East Africa or Bangladesh, places that actually have systems in place to process used fabric materials and turn them into new raw materials that can be woven again now into new kinds of fabrics. That means that literally this t-shirt will, if I donate it or somehow put it into a place where it enters that kind of a supply chain, will be literally disembodied and resurrected into some other thing that, for all we know, will come into my own hands again. That means that this t-shirt also has a global experience. By the end of its life, it might have traveled much further than I ever will. It might have met people I could never hope to meet. In doing so, it's going to have an economic impact on some of those hands that are going to process it. Hands that are, without a question, usually brown hands. They're usually impoverished hands, and they're frequently female hands, the ones that are going to be turning this into something to be used again. What does all this mean? I've touched on and intentionally tried to address the ethical implications of the things that go into wearing something that's so ordinary and so just part of my daily life. Those ethics are important and they're real. I mean, free trade in a globalized economy is important. The idea of how the cotton industry dominates the American South, that is important. Mega corporations like Amazon and our relationship to them are important. Each of these things, these are all very worthy to think and talk about. But I like to think our principles are bigger than those kinds of questions. Again, in no way to negate their relevance, but the principles go deeper. And deeper than the economic concerns of this kind of consumption. I think the lesson here has more to do with the fact that as our world becomes more and more complex, as those ethical implications become more and more intricate and intricately entailed, so much so that some of them feel quite unsolvable, the most consequential thing that I can learn from this garment is that more than even my neighbors and even some of my extended family, there are people in the world that are part of my personal universe, and my relationship with them is actually quite deep and of real consequence.
join us in our Unison Reading by Johnny. If the idea of loving those whom you have been taught to recognize as your enemies is too overwhelming, consider more deeply the observation that we are all much more alike than we are unalike.
Daoona Nayesh, Besalam. Daoona Nayesh, Be'aman.
Each week we come together as a people. Together we share stories, love, aspiration. We also share our bounty in ways that express our religious UU values. May this important ritual of sharing abundance remind us that making our world better is a task best shared.
From the Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed's book, Menage a Trois. The challenge of being in a relationship with the UUA and with Americans was an ongoing source of frustration for Canadian and other non-U.S. Unitarians. No matter how well-trained the UUA staff was, Americans held an insular worldview. The energy and patience required of Canadians to educate Americans can be compared to that of African-American UUs who often find themselves in the role of educating Euro-American UUs about racial oppression. Majority needs regularly usurp the agenda and draw attention away from meeting the needs of whichever minority, Filipino, Hispanic, African American, Canadian. At almost every turn, the focus was about the UUA and its constituencies, which is to say it was imperialist in that those needs dominated other considerations. This domination was manifest in another way. The Unitarian Universalist Church of the Philippines, the Canadian Unitarian Council, the European Unitarian Universalists, the Hungarian and Khasi Hills Unitarians were primarily in a relationship to the UUA, or the British organization, the General Assembly of Unitarian and Free Christian Churches, and not to one another.
I would like to tell you a story, a very Unitarian story, about how long it can take to accomplish something, how the work is never really done, and how our own humanity can sometimes be our biggest obstacle. But it is an inspiring story, so don't fret. The story begins in the 19th century, when the International Council of Unitarian and Other Liberal Religious Thinkers and Workers was founded in Boston on May 25, 1900. It took its inspiration from the 1893 World Parliament of Religions that happened in Chicago. In 1893, Universalists and Unitarians played a lead role, especially the Reverend Jenkins Lloyd Jones, who was the Secretary of the Parliament. It was he who pushed the Parliament to include non-Christian faiths from around the world. The International Council of Unitarian and Other Liberal Religious Thinkers and Workers is, in a way, a precursor organization to the group I really want to talk about with you today, the International Council of Unitarians and Universalists. The tale is long and winding and begins even before this beginning I just mentioned. As far back as 1818, 7 years before the founding of the American Unitarian Association, which, along with the Universalist Church of America, merged in 1961 to become the thing we know as the UUA. As far back as 1818, American Unitarians began supporting a Unitarian church in Madras, known now as Chennai, the capital city of the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. In 1820, the Calcutta Unitarian Committee is created, supported by British Unitarians. In 1825, coincidentally on the same day, May 25th, the American Unitarian Association and the British and Foreign Unitarian Association are established. Around the globe, other Unitarian groups are founded, sometimes seeded by American and British Unitarians, but also sometimes these groups create their own indigenous Unitarian belief systems, unaware of either the British or American systems. The British, who of course really seeded the American version of Unitarianism, in the beginning were probably not aware of the Transylvania Unitarians and that system which developed the first Unitarian church in the world that we know of in 1569. To this day, 450 plus years later, every church that grows from that Transylvania tradition has the words, "God is one," on their building. In 1900, the effort began to gather all of the different schools, the threads or the roots of Unitarianism around the world into communion with each other. For those of you who are used to church work, it will come as no surprise that the road has been long, there have been missteps, name changes, bungling of roles, and grace shown along the way. In 1996, the International Council of Unitarians and Universalists was created. It is this current effort at keeping Unitarian and Universalist churches around the globe in communion with each other, and to encourage and grow Unitarian Universalism where it is not yet known. A laudable goal. The journey from 1900 to 1996 has been researched in a book about it written by the Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed, author of many books on Unitarian Universalist history, including Black Pioneers in a White Denomination. Morrison Reed and his wife, Reverend Dr. Daoona Morrison Reed, were co-ministers of the First Unitarian Church of Toronto for 30 years until their retirement. Born in Chicago and raised in the First Unitarian Society of Chicago, educated in Switzerland and then at Meadville Lombard Theological School, Mark Morrison Reed was perhaps the perfect person to write this book. American by birth, European by education, and Canadian in his ministerial career, he has a deep understanding, a lived experience that allows him to sympathize and also critique American, Canadian, and European systems. The book that Mark produced from his research is called Ménage à Trois, the UUA, the GAUFCC, and IARF, and the birth of the ICUU. It's a lot of acronyms, so let me go through them. The UUA, you know. The GAUFCC is the General Assembly of Unitarian and Free Christian Churches. That's the British Unitarians. And the IARF is the International Association of Religious Freedom. And of course, ICUU is the International Council of Unitarians and Universalists. Most of what I'm sharing with you today came from that book and email exchanges I had with Mark. There are several organizations that tried to tie together our siblings of faith in the 20th century. From within the International Council of Unitarians and other religious thinkers and workers came the IARF, the International Association for Religious Freedom, the world's first global interfaith organization. And though in the beginning it was heavily influenced and led by Unitarians, it has since truly become an interfaith effort. As the decades went by, the energy and funding for these efforts came mostly from the British and Americans. Often this led to feelings of colonialism or cultural imperialism by the groups of Unitarians from other nations. This feeling did not just come from nations for whom English was not their first language. It came also from the Canadians and Australians. A little earlier in the service, Andrew shared some words about the difficulties that the non-UUA Unitarians encountered when trying to coordinate global efforts with us in the UUA. We have a distinctly American perspective, shaped by our Puritan heritage, shaped by our own culture, shaped by our own version of national exceptionalism. This is true in both the expression of our Unitarian Universalism as it is in our sense of ourselves as a nation. It is this sense of exceptionalism, our lack of humility, that has brought us so much conflict in our 400 years as an emerging culture. We have an innate sense that if you just work hard enough, all the doors will open to you. This despite the millions of examples of lives lived with hard work and people stuck in poverty for generations. In his book, Slaughterhouse-Five, Unitarian Kurt Vonnegut exposed a true character flaw in our national self-understanding. This is from his book. America is the wealthiest nation on earth, but its people are mainly poor, and poor Americans are urged to hate themselves. It is, in fact, a crime to be poor, even though America is a nation of the poor. Every other nation has folk traditions of men who were poor but extremely wise and virtuous, and therefore more estimable than anyone with power and gold. No such tales are told by the American poor. They mock themselves and glorify their betters. This leads to each and every American looking not only negatively at themselves, but also looking around to see who they are better than. Often these judgments are based on misunderstandings of worth and value. Arbitrary characteristics become evidence in a lineup that goes from most valuable to least valuable. In reality, each person is equally valuable, but so often we forget this. I'm going to take you now to 1995, the year before the formal establishment of the International Council of Unitarians and Universalists. Here I quote directly from Mark Morrison Reed's book, because it's at this point in the story, the effort to create an organization that is not dominated by the goals of the powerful, known as cultural imperialism, are seen in a pivotal moment. The conference took place in March 1995 at a retreat center in Essex, Massachusetts. The delegates came from 13 Unitarian associations: the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Australia, New Zealand, Romania, South Africa, Great Britain, Canada, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Germany, Russia, and the United States. In addition, a delegate came from the European Union of Universalists. These groups represented and ranged in size from Denmark, with 30 members, to the United States with nearly 150,000 people. The German group had determined that it would never have clergy or other professional leadership. The governance of the Romanian and Hungarian churches was hierarchical under elected bishops. The 400-year-old Transylvanian Church represented the oldest organization, and the Unitarian Universalist Association of Sri Lanka, founded in 1992, was the newest. Wolfgang Jans, who represented the Deutsche Unitarier, arrived not knowing exactly what the agenda was, nor many of the people. Ellen Campbell, executive director of the Canadian Unitarian Council, knew more. Sitting on the bus on the way to Essex, she wondered whether such a diverse group could form a community. She also wondered, could we, in just 4 short days, find common ground, lay the foundations for a stable organization, and define its purposes? Her account describes the task and captures the mood. Through the discussion, we began to identify the common factors which defined us as Unitarians or Universalists, and there they formed the preamble of their constitution. We, the member groups of the International Council of Unitarians and Universalists, affirm our belief in religious community based on the following: liberty of conscience and the individual thought in matters of faith, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice and compassion in human relations, responsible stewardship of the Earth's living system, and our commitment to democratic principles. She continued, we also drafted a purpose for our organization, but the first draft was to bring us face to face with our differences. Initially, we set out these following principles: to affirm the worldwide Unitarian and Universalist faith, to facilitate mutual support among member organizations, to promote our ideals and principles around the world, to provide models of liberal religious responses to the human condition which uphold our human values. She continued, the evening after this was drafted, we worked in small groups on specific tasks. One of the groups included Zabel Arpad of Transylvania and Leen Shoemaker of Denmark. The next day, they reported on what they had assigned. They raised a different issue. Arpad said, I can't go back to my people with a set of purposes which does not include to serve God. And Lena said, I can't go back to my humanist group with a purpose which includes to serve God. They would want it to read to serve humanity. The whole group realized that we needed to resolve this dilemma. If we couldn't find a way to describe our purposes which included everyone, the long-term health and effectiveness of the organization was in doubt. We tried to find some alternative that would work for all of us. There were a number of suggestions. Among them was infinite spirit of life. Jill McAllister of the United States looked at Arpad and said, you look more comfortable with that, Arpad. Could you accept the infinite spirit of life? Arpad nodded. Then a small smile played on his lips. Of course you know, he said. I will translate that as God. We all laughed, but we knew that we had come to a key understanding, that each of us brings our own translation to religious words and concepts. We saw that, in fact, individual thought in matters of belief, which our preamble defined as one of the basic ideas we held in common, means that we will frame our beliefs differently. We added this sentence to the statement of purpose we'd already adopted: to serve the infinite spirit of life and the human community by strengthening the worldwide Unitarian and Universalist faith. Campbell added, by the time the meeting was over, all of us felt that we had had one of those rare experiences of transcendence, in which we were able to deal with our differences and identify the things we had in common, to share a deeply spiritual experience and work our way through the mundane but necessary details of developing a set of ground rules, a constitution and bylaws, to enable us to establish ourselves. This exchange between Jill McAllister of the United States and Zabel Arpad of Transylvania is a moment of transcendence. That moment would not have been possible without decades of work by many individuals to get to Essex. And that moment could not have happened without decades of work by hundreds of people. It could not have happened without the trust established between these two people of a very similar, but not exactly same, faith understanding, without the trust the group established together. It was a very Unitarian and Universalist moment. This is the magic of faith work. For this moment, each person had to be more committed to coming together than they are to the idea that they are right. Each person had to be more committed to coming together than to being 100% comfortable. Each person has to be more committed to coming together than they are to the idea that they are right. If the people with the dominant power are not willing to listen deeply and with care to those with less power, this kind of trust cannot be built. The work of world community isn't easy, and it isn't quick. You can tell, even by this little bit of the story I've shared with you, it is laborious. And yet, it is at the root of the sixth principle of Unitarian Universalism, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. May this holy work continue for the good of everyone. These are the words of the Reverend Theodore Parker. Be ours a religion which, like sunshine, goes everywhere. Its temple, all space. Its shrine, the good heart. Its creed, all truth. Its ritual, works of love. Its profession of faith, divine living.
Profetiza, Pueblo Mio, profetiza una vez más, que tu voz en eco del clamor de los pueblos en opresión. Profetiza, Pueblo Mio, profetiza una vez más, anunciándole a los pobres Profetiza.